I'm Ed Gilbertson. I'm coming up on 86, and I was born in 1937. Devil's Lake, North Dakota. Not many people have been there. It was about 5,000 people, which was considered, quite a large town, being out in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota. Where my interest in cars started was when I was in Devil's Lake as a small boy. There was a sandbox out alongside the house, and I would play in that sandbox, and I would build little roads, and I would take little empty cartons and I would turn them into buildings and so forth. And I had a couple of little toy cars that I would drive on those roads. And so that's where my interest in cars developed. And then my grandfather had purchased a new Packard, and he died, unfortunately, 9 days before I was born. So I never got to know him. But I do remember that Packard, and I loved to get rides in it, so I guess that was more of my car interest at the time. But when we moved from Devil's Lake, I was only about 5 years old at the time, and my parents had gotten divorced, and he had left, and they really didn't have much to do with each other. My mother had a brother, my Uncle Ralph, who lived in Fargo, so she headed for Fargo. And then when my mother married my stepfather, Floyd, and moved to another part of town, there was a small house right next to this concrete building where he had an auto body repair shop. And of course, I liked that because here's this big garage, you get all these tools, you got cars and so forth. I was 11 years old, and I said, I want to have a motorcycle. So I'm down to the hardware store, and in the back of the building, there's a bicycle sitting there, a motorized bicycle. And what somebody had done, they'd taken a motorcycle, they'd removed the pedals, they had welded a flat plate where and it had mounted a 1.5 horsepower Briggs & Stratton engine. And it was a crazy contraption. The way you made it work is it had a big wheel on the back wheel with a belt, and then it had a bar, and you'd start the motor running, and then you would pull back in the bar, and it would tighten up the belt, and away you would go with just regular bicycle brakes and the like. And so that's where I started getting interested in motorized two-wheelers. So at 11 years old, I had this hardly a Davidson. It was a motorcycle, but it was a bicycle with a Briggs & Stratton engine mounted to it. But I set up a little business, and I ran it in the front of my stepfather's shop. And I'm 11 years old, and the other kids are bringing their motorized whatever to have me adjust them or fix something. So I was into it very early. And pretty soon I wanted a car, a real car. And I was looking for a hot rod, quite frankly. And what I found, and he told me about it, because he knew some of the car dealers and such in town as a result of his repair business. I remember him coming home one day, and he said, I think I found a car for you. I said, really? Where is it? And he said, it's down at the International Harvester dealer. And got it from some farmer. Well, it was a goddamn wreck. I mean, it was a clapped out 1940 Ford, which does make a good hot rod, but it didn't run. It had parts missing. It was just a nightmare. But I'd been saving up to get a car, and I had a paper route and paid $50 for a wreck that didn't run. So he towed it home back to the shop, put it in the shop, and then it was mine. So I was happy, and I had a place to put it. I had tools where I could work on it. It's where I really learned about engines and how things work. And there was a guy in the neighborhood who had a 1947 knucklehead Harley, 74 Harley. And man, it was a bob bike, and it was loud, and it was mean with the Flanders bars and down like this, and I thought, oh God, that's a great motorcycle. Really loved that motorcycle. The guy's name was Bob Schumann, again, a vet, but he had the coolest Harley in town, man, because I was hanging around those guys, and then he decided he was going to go to California, like a lot of us did, including me. You know, you're back there in the middle of the Midwest, and all the magazines and the talk is, man, all the great stuff is going on California, right? Particularly Southern California, LA. And so Bob decided that he was going to go out to California. And he had an F-100 Ford pickup that was really cool. He was going to take the motorcycle out with him. And I said, because I'd been over to his house pestering him, you know, I just loved that bike. And it had big shotgun buoys on it, straight pipes and big megaphones. Oh my God, that thing was loud. I loved it. And it was fast. And so when I heard that he was going to go to California, I said, are you going to take your knucklehead with you? And he said, well, I don't think so. He said, I'll probably sell it, and I load up the truck, and when I get out to California, I'll buy another bike. And I said, you know, I'd like to have your motorcycle. He said, how the hell are you going to do that? I said, well, I got another paper route. I also am selling ice cream bars. I pull a little cart behind me, sell them for 10 cents. I get a penny for each one. I said, how much you want for the bike? He said, no way you're going to buy this goddamn bike. He said, I know you want it. You haven't even ridden anything like that. I said, well, I know how to ride a motorcycle. He said, you know how to ride that bicycle that's got a motor on it. And you know how to handle a scooter. You went down to the gravel on that, cut yourself up. And no, that's not going to work. I said, look, don't sell it to anybody. Really, don't sell it to anybody. He said, you'll never get the money for it. It wasn't cheap. It was $400. That was a lot of money in that day. So I managed to get the money together, my paper route money, my ice cream bar money. I had making a little money helping sweep up my stepfather's shop and keeping it clean. And I saved every damn penny. And I remember the day I went over there and I said, I got the money for your bike. He said, like hell you do. I said, and I had it in cash. I said, here it is. He said something like, I'll be goddamned. I said, you know how to handle this thing? I'd never been on a Harley. I'd just been around them. He said, I want to make sure you know how to ride this bike before I sell it to you. So we went out on the highway, which was not too far, straight stretch. And I'm riding my scooter, bicycle, or some darn thing. And he says, okay. He says, I'm going to stop out there in that straight stretch by the airport. I want to see you ride this bike. Well, of course, I told him I know how to ride that. I'd never been on one. And I thought, oh man, this has got to work. If I want this bike, this has got to work. So I managed to get on it. And I knew the controls because I'd been watching the guys ride their Harleys. And I managed to make it up the highway. And I said, how am I going to turn around? But I managed to turn around and come back. He said, okay, you know how to ride it. You got the money, it's yours. But I felt I was really taking it. I said, oh, God, please, please. And I'd never ridden anything like that I managed to do it. And I was still hanging around the Harley guys who had formed a club. Well, they were astounded that I managed to get that bike. But when I'd ride, you know, they were experienced riders, and they were pretty wild. It was, like most of the clubs back then, a pretty wild group. And so I would try and tail along with them, and of course I'd fall way behind, but I'd catch up with them, and they'd have their rallies, and we did a lot of great stuff. But I was, you know, certainly the youngest. And I'd see these guys with these sexy chicks jumping on the back of their bike and heading out for the weekend. And I thought, wow, I wonder if I'll get to do that someday. And but the motorcycle, they were a wild bunch. I often wondered why my stepfather and my mother, particularly my mother, went along with this. But they didn't say much about me having a car at 13. And they never said much about having this motorcycle at 15, which was really a hopped up bike, suicide clutch, and I'm out there riding with these guys that are real hell raisers. So I guess I have to give them credit for even letting me do that. Now, one thing that did happen is that when they had this hot rod club, and of course I had my clapped out 40 Ford, so I not only wanted to be out there with the motorcycle guys, but I wanted to be with the hot rod club, and which was called the Rod Benders. And they weren't quite as wild as the motorcycle guys, but they were getting in their own kinds of trouble. And the only thing my mother ever said against that was there was a lake about 50, 60 miles away in Minnesota, Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, and the Rod Benders were going to make a run down there. And my mom kind of put her foot down. She said, I'm going to have to ask you not to do that. Well, I wasn't happy. I said, why not? I get to do all this other stuff. She says, I know what will happen. You're going to go down there. There are going to be people that have had too much to drink. There's going to be fights. No, you're not going. That's the only time I ever remember she said, no, you're not going to that. And I was kind of angry, but I didn't. I decided, like Schumann and some of the other guys, we had to get out to California. And I was still in high school, and my friend Don in the neighborhood, he had gotten a Harley. He'd gotten a Harley Panhead, and he was a good friend of mine. We did a lot of riding together once we both had a real motorcycle. And so we planned summer vacation, we're going to just head out. Well, every year for 3 years, he had some damned excuse why he couldn't go. And I finally, the third time, I said, Don, when the time comes, you don't seem to be able to go, so I'm going to go myself. And I said, Mom, I'm leaving for the summer. She said, you are? Where are you going? I'm going to California. What do you mean you're going to California? How are you going to get there? I'm going to ride the Harley. She said, who are you going with? I'm going by myself, because Don and I have talked about it, and he's not available. No, I'm taking off, and I'm leaving tomorrow. And she said, I can't believe this. I said, I got to get out there. That's where all the good stuff is going, the hot rods and the motorcycles. And she said, be careful. So I ride out to California, which was quite an adventure. And I'm riding across the desert, and I'm sleeping alongside the road and all that, wherever, I'd get tired, and I'd get off the bike and just sleep in the ditch or something, right, or behind a billboard. But I remember clearly, I'm in Las Vegas. I took off early in the morning, and as we get to LA, I began to see these freeways, right? I'd never seen a freeway before. We get to the Hollywood freeway, which is the first big interchange in the country. Oh my God. And then I start seeing, these cool cars. And I'd see a hot rodder, I'd see these motorcycles come by. I thought, oh, this is great, this is great. So I stayed out there for the summer, and I got a job out there. And I just had a hell of a good time, all the shops and the clubs. And I thought, oh man, this is heaven. And I had even kind of decided that I would like to stay out there. But I had a year as a freshman at North Dakota State, which is back in Fargo. I had a girlfriend, which I'd left back there. A little bit of a thought process, Long story short, like me when Schumann had that knucklehead, there was a guy that I rode with out there, and he loved that bike. And we had great times out there. On Friday night, the guys who were really into riding, we would meet in the parking lot of that Capitol Records building. It's still there. The big round building is still there. If you wanted to go riding for the weekend, meet at the Capitol Records parking lot Friday night. And we'd get a big group together, and we'd head for Lake Arrowhead, going like hell. And we get out there and we raise hell and drink for the weekend and try and make it back to work on Monday. And this guy liked my bike so much, and I thought about it. I said, oh man, what am I going to do here? Anyway, what I decided to do was sell the bike. I said, I'll get another one when I get back, just like Schumann. And so he got the bike, and I often wonder what happened to it, because it was a cool bike. I hope it's still around. And I boarded a Greyhound bus, and I spent 3 days on a damn Greyhound bus riding back to Fargo so that I could start my sophomore year. I'd been in ROTC. You know, I liked airplanes. And and I'm kind of interested in the military. So I said, I'll go, you know, Air Force ROTC, right? I'm going to be a fighter pilot. But the thing that happened is that each year we would take a physical, including an eye test. And I had 20/20, and in those days to get into pilot training, you had to have 20/20. When you made that final physical, you had to test 20/20, or you weren't going to get there. So I had 20/20 my sophomore year, my junior year, my senior year. I've gone through ROTC. I have an active duty commitment, and I'd go in for the last physical. The best I can make is 20/50, and I tried 3 times. And of course, now I'm newly minted second lieutenant, right? Headed for active duty. And I said, like I said, they said, sir, you know, you tried 3 times, you know, you're not 20/20. But you can make 20/50, which means you can be a navigator, right? And I said, well, I hear you, and that puts me in an airplane, but it's also going to put me in a bomber sitting behind the pilot and co-pilot. No, if I can't be the pilot, I'll pass. I didn't know when I was going to be going on active duty, and so I took a job with Boeing. I was interested in automobiles. I interviewed with Ford. I could have gone to work for Ford, a couple other of them, but the thing to go is get in the space program, right? And so I headed for Boeing, and it was a pretty good job. And I was working in the missile program, which was the big deal in those days. But once I got there, I also took further notice of sports cars. And so that's where I bought my first sports car. And I bought a 57 Austin Healey and liked it, and didn't have a motorcycle at that time. But the thing was, I didn't last very long because I was only there 3 months and I got called to active duty. And I said, oh crap, you know, I kind of like this job, working on the missile and vibration dynamics and so forth. But no, report to active duty. My report station was March Air Force Base, Riverside Raceway. I had never seen or heard of Ferrari. Like a lot of young guys, we rented a house and there were 4 or 5 of us, and my bedroom was the couch. And so I didn't have much that I needed to take with me. I loaded it all in Healy, and I drove straight through to Riverside and landed at March Air Force Base, fully expecting that they're going to use me as an engineer, right? And they said, well, engineers are important, but right now we have enough for this particular area, whatever. But we're short on meteorologists. You're on full active duty. We'll send you to UCLA, all expenses paid. You'll be back in college and get another degree. I said, well, that sounds pretty cool. I'm going back to LA where all the cars and the motorcycles are, and I'm back as a regular college student, except on an active duty, and they're paying for everything. What a hell of a deal. And so I did exactly that. And then I get that degree, and so I come up for reassignment. Well, my first preference was the Tactical Air Command, Langley Field, Virginia. That's where all the fighter squadrons are, right? That's where the headquarters of the Tactical Air Command is. I said, man, I hope I get there. It came through. I went from March Air Force Base with a newly minted meteorology degree straight for Langley Field. I said, cool. Langley Field, of course, they have a meteorology detachment, and that was really cool because when the fighter squadrons would go off in their exercises, I'd watch them, as fighter jocks, you know, hot shoes. They'd take off ahead of us. We'd follow them to C-130. We'd work around the clock, and then they'd give us some time off, and then we'd all get together. And of course, I'd gotten to know quite a few of the pilots. I was given their weather briefs and stuff, and when they went to party, I'd join them. And man, raise hell, talk about raise hell. And then, of course, I was still interested in being near airplanes, so I decided that I was going to put in for jump school, Fort Benning, right? And if I managed to get through that, you become a forward air controller. Pretty dangerous job, but pretty exciting to me. I was still in my 20s. So I put in for jump school, and then a request comes through that they're forming a new unit, the Missile Command, right? And they're looking for people who would like to volunteer to become a missile officer. And they played it up quite a bit, because I knew that as a weather officer and not being a pilot, I was never going to get those wings. And it was very clear, and still is today, that you're not going to get to general officer unless you have wings. And I knew I'd never have wings. But then they play up this new missile group in Strategic Air Command, and they're going to give you what they call the pocket rocket. You're not going to get wings, but you're going to get a pocket rocket, and that'll put you in some competition for the higher positions. So I said, well, I'll put in for that. I don't know if I'll get it. I'll put it into you. But I got it. Anyway, long story short, sent through missile crew training at a base in Illinois, and then got sent from there to Great Moss, Montana. And that was interesting too, because I thought to myself, well, here I am. My first engineering job was working on the Minuteman missile for Boeing. And here I am, a few years later, I'm in Strategic Air Command, and I'm back with the Minuteman. Here comes the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And we knew that the Russians, Khrushchev, was threatening to cross the boundary, and Kennedy was serious. He was prepared to go to war if those Russian ships carrying missiles were going to cross that line. And the Air Force took it serious. They put all the B-52s in the air. They selected a small number of us, including myself and my crew buddy, and said, you're going out to the site. We don't know when you're coming back, and you're not to say anything to your family. Just go. We got in that underground capsule, and very few people know this. They would use a B-52 they called Skybird, and that's where we got our exercise direction. But you never knew whether it was real or not. You start off running exercise, and you know what the steps are. But always in the past, it had gotten to a certain step, and then they'd say exercise, pull back. And we had done that countless times. We had two stations, but they placed them far enough apart so that you both had to do the same thing. We had loaded guns, and we were told that if our crew buddy ever made a false move, you were to shoot him. So we're down there, and of course we're getting the instructions. We're going through the same thing. You pull out the code, you decipher it for today and all that sort of thing. Same way we had. They always called it off before we touched those launch switches. And we get up to that point, and they didn't stop us. And Dan looks over at me, he says, Ed, I think this might be it. I said, I think you might be right. And so we flip up the caps, and there's the toggle switches, one for each warhead. And we really did think that was it. And the last minute, Khrushchev decided to pull back. But we were that close. We were that damn close to launching a nuclear war. It would be just the two of us. Well, then every once in a while, they would pull a crew from somewhere in the country. They'd send them down to Vandenberg Air Force Base to do an actual firing. And so Dan Rogers and myself, we got picked to do that. So we're down there a few days. Our firing gets set up. And guess what? We were all set to go. And I think Dan heard it first. He said, Jesus, you can't believe what just happened. He said, Kennedy just got shot. I said, you're kidding. He said, yeah, they've shut down everything. We're not going. So we never got to do our actual firing. But we then came back to the base in Great Falls, Montana. But then I said, it's getting a little, I'm still in the Air Force. I'm in an important position. I'm in a responsible position. But, I get up, jump on a helicopter, go 100 feet underground and sit there with my crew buddy, running through exercises. And, it gets a little repetitive. So I'm not sure I want to do this. So we went in and we saluted him smartly. Yeah, what do you guys want? We want out. What do you mean you want out? We're fed up with the Vietnam War and the way it's handled. We're fed up with what the government is doing. We want out. And he said, you're a regular officer. I said, I know that, sir. He says, well, then we'll let you out when we're damn ready to leave you out. And so they reassigned me. I had a meteorology degree, right? So they assigned me to Gunter Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. And so I pack up and once again headed down to Gunter in the Healy. And I get there and I fully expect to be put in the bachelor officers' quarters, right? Gunter Air Force Base is also the reporting point. It's like March Air Force Base, a reporting point for me. It was a reporting point for all the Air Force nurses coming on active duty. They said, sir, we'll get you into BAQ when there's a space. In the meantime, we're going to put you over in the nurses' quarters. I thought, well, I think that might be all right. So what would happen every 3 weeks, these college gals who had been in, ROTC or something, or they had signed up, they report to Gunter Air Force Base. They live in this big building, and I'm the only guy in there. Every once in a while, they call me up and say, Captain Gilbertson, we got room in the BAQ for you now. And I'd say, well, I'm kind of busy right now. I really don't have time, and they'd give it to somebody else. I never left those nurses' quarters. But I'd been there quite a while, and I wasn't going to be staying in the Air Force. And I knew meteorology, and I was the squadron commander there because I had experience and pretty much ran my own schedule. But, I wanted to get on with my life. I mean, I can't screw around like this forever. So they let me out. And I thought about going back to Boeing. But I also had the Healy. And I knew, because I lived there, that it rained every damn day in Seattle. It rained. So I decided to head for Northern California. And I got a job with AT&T in Sacramento. And that's where I met Sherry. I remember one of the guys was having, like young guys do, you get together, you have a house party or something, right? And so I go over there and I meet Sherry for the first time. And she had just come out of college. I said, well, geez, pretty good looking gal, and she seems to be pretty smart. But I said, okay, and I went on my way. And I didn't see her again for a while. I was living with my friend Buzz, who unfortunately is no longer with us, and we were having a good time all the time. And he decides to have a house party, right? And he's inviting a lot of people we know, and I show up, and everybody's coupled up with Sherry and I. And of course, I'd only met her very briefly, and we wound up talking that night. And we never left each other. The Beezer, I bought the Beezer before I met Sherry. It was a 66, and the BSA dealer called me up and he said, I know you're kind of interested in the BSA, and I was prepared to buy a new one. He said, we got a BSA Lightning. It's only 6 months old, and it's like new. The guy just couldn't keep up the payments. So if you want to come over and get it, it's here. And so I got a good deal on it, and I rode that for quite a while. I no longer had the Healy. I'm making a little more money. I bought a Jaguar E-Type 4.2. God, that was a great car. So I had both the BSA and the Jag, and I liked them both, and we were getting along fine. But I also was being sent to AT&T headquarters. You know, I'm a fair-haired boy or something, or they were going to send me back to headquarters for further grooming. But I'd been to New York City enough to know that if I took that Jag to Manhattan, the streets are going to beat it all to hell, right? And so I sold the Jag just before I left for New York City. And so I had only known Sherry for about 2 weeks. So I take her out the night before I leave for New York, right, where I'm going to have a regular job assignment, probably 3 years or something, a headquarters assignment. We're sitting in, I took her to a restaurant, a good restaurant, wanted her to have a nice time. We're getting toward the end of the meal. She leans across the table like this. She said, "Ed, I've got something to tell you." I said, "What's that?" She says, "I'm going to New York with you." Just like that, going to New York with you. I said, "What do you mean you're going to New York with me?" "I'm not leaving you, I'm coming with you." We got to New York, got this rundown one-bedroom apartment in Hell's Kitchen. So she comes and she's staying with me there. In the meantime, I've developed this interest in stocks and bonds, and I'm doing it on the side while I'm still working as an engineer. And one day I said to Sherry, I said, "Man, you've really made it fast on Wall Street. You know what you're doing. I've really picked up on stocks and bonds." I said, "Let's both quit our jobs and go into business together." And then, because we're going to have our own business, I want to get back to California. And so I told AT&T that I would like to transfer. And so we both headed here, and we've been here ever since. The first year back here, in late '74, we moved into this house. I had the garage space. I wanted to do two things. I wanted to get a Harley, back on a Harley, and I wanted to get a sports car. And I loved the Ferrari. Said, "I'll have one of those one day." I told a guy at work here, just before I left my job with AT&T, and he says, "I know where you can get a Ferrari Lusso. The dealer has one." So I went over and looked at it. I saw that car. I said, "That's my car. That's it. It's the color I want. It's beautiful." And so I stretched for it, got it. It's the first car to be in this garage. And I said to Sherry, she'd remember this, that I got my Ferrari Lusso. I've got my dream car. I don't need anything else. But then you begin to be around other Ferraris, and they're all different, right? And you already gotten the fever, which is a terminal disease. So I love my Lusso. It's the only thing I ever need. And then I see a 275 GTB, and oh my God, it doesn't look anything like a Lusso, but it's fantastic. And so that's where it went. But no, once I got out here, I got back on a Harley and kept the BSA, and then got involved with the groups of motorcycles out here. And of course, I always have to keep going. And so pretty soon I wind up hanging out with the Hells Angels. The dealerships, the Harley factory, decided that they would form a club called HOG, Harley Owners Group. And so Dudley Perkins, like most of the dealers, formed a chapter, the HOG chapter, right? Sounds good to me. So I joined the HOG chapter, and then they would have monthly meetings down in the basement of Dudley Perkins, which I would go to. And then I wound up writing their chapter newsletter. Thunder Press called me and invited me to be one of their columnists, one of their first columnists. So I wrote for Thunder Press for 7 years, a column called Taking It to the Streets. So we had a bunch of us running with the Harley Owners Group. And when you go out, you're out with 200 bikes. And some of them know how to ride, and some of them don't know how to ride. And you stop at a gas station, and everything comes to a halt. And so I said to some of my best riding buddies, I said, how would you guys like to form a club with me? Because, you know, this hog thing is just too many dangerous riders and too many people that don't know how to ride. I want to form a club. Are you interested? We're going to limit it to 13 members. We're going to run it like a patch club. So they said, yeah, we're interested. I said, well, if you're going to be an MC in California, the Hells Angels are the #1 club, and you better not be running around saying you're an MC unless you have their approval. And since I'm the president of this club, I'll be the one that goes over and talk to them, which I did. And we formed our logos and all of that. And of course, I was a skull freak, so I wanted the skull. I didn't want it to look too much like skull with wings. So I went over to the Hells Angels Clubhouse on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's still there. And said, you know, I'm so-and-so. I'd like to form an MC club. And I know to do that and advertise yourself as an MC club, you're the #1 club, so that's why I'm here. And Big Wayne, who is the president, he says, you know, go back and talk to Steve there behind the curtain. You know, he handles shit like this. So I went back to Big Steve, their sergeant of arms. You want to be an MC, huh? Well, you better tell us what kind of colors you plan to run, because we get too many people that want to be too much like us. And so I said, well, it's going to have a skull. And he says, well, no, don't give me a bunch of shit. Just draw it up and come over here and let me see it, which I did. So I had to go over there 3 times because I like the Hells Angels. You know, I like that skull and the wings and all of that. So the first time I go over there, he says, oh, Christ. He said, no, that's not going to do. That's running too close to us. And he said, that bottom rocker, you got California on there. You know, you can't use California. California is our bottom rocker. You're going to have to come up with something else. So I went back there a second time. And when I went in the second time, well, I didn't say California. I said Northern California. They said, no, that's not going to work either. So the third time I went back, the symbol, they said, was okay. And the bottom rocker, I changed to Golden Gate. And so now we're approved to run as an MC patch club. And of course, I got to know those guys quite well. I've been over their clubhouse a number of times. But what is really interesting is that the group that I formed called the Iron Monks MC, which still exists, they're running strong, which you know, it's satisfying to see that it was well organized enough. They're still going. And they invite us back to their traditional picnic or Christmas party or what, you know, things they do each year. But what was interesting, I got so deep into the motorcycle life, and I was making my way through. I knew I didn't want to become a Hells Angel, because you become a full member of the Hells Angels, you know too much, and you don't get out unless you get carried out. I kept them so separate. The car world had no idea I was that deep. The biker world had no idea I was that deep into cars. And where it came to a head, I'm a judge at the Palo Alto Concours. They had a motorcycle class there one year. And so we're all suited up and looking very official. And we come walking down to the judges' meeting through the cars, and there's the motorcycles. I said, sure, I want to take a look at the motorcycle, see what they came up with. We got with about 20 paces, and here comes the president of the Hells Angels in full color, right? And I know him well. He comes walking toward me, and he squints, bends down, says, is that you? Is that you? What the hell are you doing in that getup? And then we talked a little bit, and he said, well, I'll be goddamned. I didn't know you were interested in these cars. Well, at that point, they were beginning to collide. I mean, the car world, it was much different than the biker world. Like I said, the Iron Monks, which I was president of for a number of years, still invite us to their traditional events. And not more than a couple of years ago, Dave, who was a charter member, came up to me, he's still active, and said, well, we know there came a point where you had to choose one or the other, even though you're still riding. I said, yeah, I guess I got pretty deep into the car world. He said, that was the right choice. Now, this is a hardcore biker. He said, you made the right choice. I said, why is that? Because if you'd stayed in and gotten deeper, you'd either be dead or in prison. And he's right. I had all these great cars. I had a lot, Ferraris, Cobras, Talbot Lago, Healey's, Jaguars. You know, I basically had all my dream cars as I became more successful and started making money with the business and all. I had all my dream cars basically and had a lot of fun with them. When I was 12 years old in Fargo, I had my little hardly a Davidson and scooter, and then finally got my knucklehead. But a block away, there was a guy by the name of Willie Onstead, and he was building a deuce, three-window deuce. And he was doing it in the garage behind his house. And the doors, I look in, and here's this guy working on his hot rod. He's working on a 32. And so he asked me what I wanted, and I said, well, you know, I like hot rods, and I got a car I'm trying to do things with, and I'd kind of like to watch what you do. He said, well, you see that crate over there? You want to come over and watch me build my hot rod? Sit on that crate and stay quiet. And so after school, on many days, I would walk in, I would sit down in the crate and just watch him build that deuce. So a dozen years ago, before I bought this deuce, just before I bought this deuce, I said, I'm going to try and find Willie Onstead. I wonder if he's still alive. So I did some Google search. I talked to a couple of people in Fargo who knew of his family and found that he was still alive. And I called him up, and he said, well, who are you? And I said, you remember that kid that used to come over to your garage and sit on a box and watch you build your hot rod? That's me. And I said, I always liked that. I always wanted a deuce, and I always wanted a deuce like yours. I said, I'm going to try and find your car. And he sent me some pictures. And I contacted Bruce Meyer and Ken Gross and Roy Brizio, all the guys. I showed them pictures. I said, yeah, it's a good rod, but we haven't seen anything like that. But I couldn't find it. Nobody could give me any information. And so I said, well, I'm going to have to pass on Willie's deuce, but I'm going to try find one just like his. Now, the unfortunate thing that happened is that when that car was accepted for the Grand National, two things were disappointing. I mean, I was elated to have that car in the Grand National and win that trophy. But the sad part is that the guy who built, you know, Randy Lowen, killed in his head-on auto accident 5 years ago, so he wasn't there to enjoy it. And then I said, I'm going to try and get a hold of Willie, and I'm going to send him pictures of the car named after him, and I'm going to tell him I searched as much as possible. I couldn't find his, but I found one just like it. The only difference that it's a Roadster. He died last year, just a few months. But I think both of those people have been very happy that, first of all, Willie's three-window, that's a follow-on, and the car is named after him. And Randy Lowen, I talked to his widow, and she cried. She cried. She said, I remember that car. We didn't know what had happened to that. And I said, well, I'm going to name him because the great hot rods that are down there, they usually carry the name of the original builder. It's going to be entered as the Randy Lowen hot rod. And yeah, I wish you were here.